It was discovered at that time Terry Bollea, also known as Hulk Hogan, was experiencing a serious medical-related issue.
When Hulk Hogan passed away, many said the reason was clear, that he had a heart attack. At his age and with the many surgeries he went through, it's easy to believe that explanation. A body that endured decades of pain inside the ring. But as the details are looked into more closely, some things are noticed. There was a security system that was disabled from inside the house. A call was made in the middle of the night by an unknown person. Some things in the house are unexplained, but this doesn't mean a crime necessarily occurred. But it's enough to raise questions, because sometimes a story is deeper than the first explanation. And to understand everything, we need to go back to what happened before that last day. But before we start, don't forget to like this video. It's a big deal for us content creators. Thank you so much, and now let's get started. When found, Hulk Hogan was already lifeless. In his mansion in Clearwater, many people thought that was the quiet end of the life of a big name in wrestling. The first explanation that came out was a heart attack, and for most people that was enough as a reason, especially for a man who spent decades punishing his body inside the ring. He had also been dealing with serious health problems for years and had undergone many surgeries. So it's easy to believe that maybe his heart just couldn't take it anymore. On the morning of July 24, 2025, a 911 call came in about a man who was no longer breathing. The paramedics arrived immediately and performed CPR and other methods to try to restore his breathing and heartbeat before taking him to Morton Plant Hospital. They worked for several hours to restore his heartbeat, but around 11:17 a.m., he was declared dead. According to the medical examiner, his cause of death was acute myocardial infarction, more commonly known as a heart attack, and it was considered natural causes. At the age of 71, and with a long history of physical exhaustion and injuries to his body, many people saw the logic in that official explanation. However, there were some details at the scene of the incident that made the authorities cautious in their investigation. They examined the entire mansion and interviewed the witnesses. Before the incident, to ensure that every part of the timeline was clear and that nothing was missing or inconsistent, some parts of the house were closely inspected, and the security system was also examined to make sure that no one else entered or influenced what happened. They also included his complete medical records in their review to see if there were any signs that might have served as a warning before the sudden heart attack. While tributes from former rivals and fans continued to arrive outside his home, inside the investigation, authorities quietly made sure that all the details matched the official conclusion. In cases like this, careful examination is important, especially when the deceased is a well-known person with a long history of physical sacrifice in his work. Despite public speculation and emotions, the official report remains the basis of truth. As the investigators examined the inside of Hulk Hogan's mansion more closely, every step became more cautious because even the smallest detail could affect the overall understanding of what happened. At first glance, the medical conclusion was clear that acute myocardial infarction or heart attack was the cause of his death, and there were no immediate signs of foul play. But because he was known all over the world, they couldn't just rely on first impressions. So a more thorough investigation was still necessary. Upon entering his personal gym, authorities expected to see normal signs of regular use because, according to people close to him, he exercised there almost every day. But the room was tidy and showed almost no signs of recent use because the weights were carefully lined up. There were no open water bottles, no towels, and the floor mats looked like they hadn't been touched for several days. For someone known for his discipline in exercising, this scene did not immediately match his expected daily routine, and even though it was not evidence of a crime, it was still included in the investigation as a detail that needed to be explained. Next, the security system of the house in Clearwater was examined because the property had an advanced surveillance system with multiple cameras and digital access. And investigators expected that the activity log would help in building a clear timeline. It was discovered that the system was disabled before the emergency call, and the disabling was done from inside the house using the correct access code. So there were no signs of forced entry and no indication of mechanical failure. Digital records showed that there was manual interaction with the control panel within the last hour before he was found, although this does not necessarily mean a crime occurred. This shows that there was activity on the system at a sensitive time, so it was included in a deeper investigation. Due to the high level of attention on the case, digital forensics specialists were brought in to examine the smart home logs, internal network data, and backup servers. Because of modern homes, records of lights, thermostat adjustments, and motion sensors can help build a more detailed timeline. There were some recorded system interactions, but no external breach or remote hacking was identified. So there's no evidence that anyone else accessed the system from the outside. During a more thorough inspection of the house, a modified storage area was also discovered, which wasn't immediately noticed during the initial inspection because it had separate wiring and ventilation. However, no illegal equipment or anything directly related to the cause of death was found either, so it was only included in the official report. Despite all these details, the medical examiner's conclusion remained the same because there were no defensive wounds, no signs of physical struggle, and no toxins found during the examination. So the cause of death remained natural. In the end, the case remains classified as a natural death according to the official report, and a thorough examination was conducted to remove any doubt and ensure every detail. When a well-known person is involved, it's natural for more questions to arise, but in the process of investigation, what matters most are clear data and not speculation. And based on the available data, the conclusion remains clear. While the examination of the electronic logs and the mansion's security system continued, the investigators realized that the answer might not be in the machines, but in the people they talked to. Conversations of the retired wrestling icon in his final days. The new person he meets is not someone he usually encounters, but someone who continues to be involved in matters, music, always. What could be inside that different wrapping? But that night, there was a strange tension in his movements, and his answers were brief before he ended the call. For the investigators, the exact words on the other end weren't immediately important, but rather the clear effect it had on his behavior. The call metadata was examined, and it was discovered that the signal passed through several international relays and proxy nodes, so every attempt to trace the origin ended up being rerouted to another country, and this showed that it wasn't just a simple prank call or a random dial. This kind of masking requires sufficient knowledge and resources, so it's clear that the caller intended to remain unidentified. There was no immediate evidence pointing to extortion or a direct threat, but it was still included in the timeline because the call came at a sensitive time before his death. Before the incident, his routine was normal because he continued exercising, interacted normally with his family, and was focused on his recovery from the operation. After the call, those close to him noticed that he became quieter and seemed to be thinking about something he didn't want to share. There is no clear recording to prove the content of the conversation, but for the investigative team, the clear change in his behavior is enough. As part of the overall analysis, a call, a disabled security system, and an unusually clean gym are the details they are looking at, and these may be separate incidents or could be part of a single event that they do not fully understand yet. In cases like this, sometimes the most important evidence is not just the physical marks, but the small change in a person's behavior before the last morning of his life. As the last days of the retired wrestling icon were investigated more closely, It became clear to the investigators that technical evidence alone was not enough, and they also needed to understand the personal side of his life, such as his relationships and the situation within his family. In front of the public, he was known as a symbol of strength and confidence, but in his private life, his situation was more complicated than most people saw. He was with his first wife for more than 20 years, and they had 2 children together. They were once considered a model modern celebrity family, especially when their reality show was released in the mid-2000s, where everything seemed perfect on camera. Behind the smiles and television appearances, there was tension in their relationship, and allegations of infidelity surfaced, leading to a public separation. And the wrestler admitted in interviews that he went through severe depression after their divorce. A few years later, the wrestler got married again, and that relationship was more private and quieter. But that also ended, and in the later part of his life, he had a younger partner who brought a simpler and more disciplined lifestyle. On the outside, his later years seemed more balanced. But according to some people close to him, a distance had formed between them and with one of his children because of years of misunderstandings and unresolved conversations. After his sudden death in this story, it was revealed that his estate was not divided equally, and only one child was the main beneficiary, while another was not included in the document. This does not immediately mean a crime, nor is it proof of bad intentions. However, in any investigation involving an unexpected death, financial records and inheritance arrangements are usually examined as part of standard procedure. The investigators examined the financial records in the weeks before the incident, and they did not find any sudden transfer of assets or unusual changes in insurance policies. And there was also no legal dispute filed during that time. However, the emotional context is still important because strained relationships can affect a person's stress level and mental state. In a case where a security system was disabled and there were noticeable changes in behavior before the incident, the personal life cannot be separated from the overall investigation. Sometimes the most important detail can't be found in the laboratory report or digital log, but in the people close to him and the decisions made before the final chapter of his life. While investigators examine the medical aspect of the case, it is known that the body of the retired wrestling icon in this story had long endured extreme trials for many years. He underwent more than 24 surgeries over several decades, including operations on his back, hips, knees, and shoulders. And almost every part of his body was operated on to relieve pain and extend his career. Each operation helped him stay active, but at the same time it also added to the long-term effects, the long-term risks to his health, especially as he gets older. The most serious of all was the multi-level cervical spine surgery performed a few months before his death in this story. In this type of operation, the damaged disc in the neck is removed and the bones in the spine are fused together to restore stability and reduce pressure on the nerves. And when more than one level is repaired and the patient is in their 70s, the possibility of complications is higher. There is a possibility of delayed cardiac stress or sudden strain on the heart. And there is also a possibility of breathing problems, especially if the patient has other existing conditions. And sometimes complications appear a few weeks or months after the operation. On the outside, his recovery seems to be going well because there are photos of him smiling and gradually returning to the gym. But complications are not always visible in photos or short video clips. While examining the medical aspect, investigators also conducted a second forensic sweep of the mansion to ensure that no detail was missed. In the basement, behind a wall that looked ordinary, a hidden room was discovered with separate ventilation and its own wiring system. And there were several documents, storage containers, and electronic hardware that were not connected to the main home network. No immediate evidence of a crime was found inside. But this discovery was enough to open a new line of investigation. They examined the dust patterns, fingerprints, and digital residue on the devices inside, and there were indications that they had been used recently. But it's not clear whether this was just a private archive or secure storage for sensitive material. At this point, investigators are simultaneously following three lines of inquiry. The first is the possibility of a natural cardiac event. With numerous operations and intense physical stress over many years. The second is the possibility of a stress-triggered episode related to an unclear event in his final days. Third is the significance of the room found inside the house. And if it is related to the overall incident, there is still no direct evidence of foul play. But in a case with unusual details in the house and in the state of health, every small piece of information is included in the overall picture before reaching a conclusion. Inside the hidden room in the mansion's basement, the picture of the last days of the retired wrestling icon became even more complicated. This is not just an ordinary storage space because the documents are neatly arranged. The labeling is clear and the organization is systematic, so it looks like a personal archive that was intentionally hidden but carefully preserved. There are medical records. There are statements and printed communications organized in separate folders. What caught the investigators' attention more were some documents dated just a day before his death in this story, which means there was recent access to the room. There were no signs of forced entry, and the security system was disabled from inside the house. So it's only natural to include in the investigation who last used the room and when it was last opened. There were folders that seemed ordinary and related to estate planning, post-surgery reports, and routine financial documents. However, there were some documents that couldn't immediately be matched to his public life because there were contact references unknown to the family and printed exchanges that seemed to contain sensitive content. There was no immediate evidence of blackmail and no direct proof of illegal activity. However, the discovery was enough to broaden the scope of the investigation. For the family in this story, it's not just a legal or forensic issue, but also an emotional confrontation with the possibility that there was a part of his life they didn't fully know. To the public, his legacy in the ring remains clear, and he continues to be a symbol of strength for a generation. But in the private space of his own home, there are questions that haven't been answered right away and details that still lack a complete explanation. The official cause of death in this story remains a cardiac event, supported by a long history of surgery and physical stress. In this kind of story, sometimes the greatest mystery isn't the one with clear evidence of a crime, but the realization that someone you thought you knew completely still has parts you never knew about. The possibility that the retired wrestling icon's spinal surgery a few months before his death may have played a role in the sudden cardiac arrest has remained part of the discussion in this story. According to his wife in this story, if the phrenic nerve, which controls the movement of the diaphragm, was affected, it could have caused breathing problems that eventually put severe strain on his already compromised heart. There is still no official ruling confirming surgical evidence. The possibility of error and of a medical complication are not being ruled out as the investigation continues. At the same time, the financial details of his estate, estimated to be worth several $1 million, also became part of the discussion, and it was revealed that only one child is the primary beneficiary, while the other is not included in the will. That decision may have personal and emotional reasons, and it does not necessarily mean there was bad intention. But in any high-profile case, the inheritance is usually scrutinized as part of the overall review. The investigators in this story continue to review the medical findings, digital records, and testimonies of people close to him to create a clear timeline of his final days. For the fans of this story, it's difficult to balance remembering his legacy and facing the questions about the final chapter of his life. There was a disabled security system. There was an unclear phone call at night. There was a complication, a major operation, and a family with misunderstandings. It could all be natural, and it could be that a body that has gone through decades of intense physical stress finally gave out. As the review of what happened in this story continues, it's important to clearly organize the events of the last 72 hours before the incident. The investigators first identified the exact time when he was last seen in good condition. They examined the text messages, phone logs, and security camera timestamps were checked to see if there were any discrepancies or missing periods in the timeline. It was found that his communication with family and some friends was normal on the day before the incident. There were no messages indicating a clear threat or serious conflict. But it was noticed that his replies were shorter and more formal than usual. In cases like this, it's important to know what a person's normal behavior is. That's where you can see if there's a change in the pattern. The medical monitoring devices he used after the operation were also examined. His blood pressure and oxygen levels were stable for several days, but there was one night when his oxygen saturation slightly dropped. This was only temporary and wasn't immediately noticed, but it was still included in the medical review. The medicines he was taking were also checked. After the spinal surgery, he was on a combination of pain medication, anti-inflammatory drugs, and medicine for blood pressure. When certain medications are combined, they can put a strain on the heart, especially if there is a pre-existing condition. According to the toxicology report in this story, no illegal substances were found. However, there was a combination of prescribed medication that could add stress to the heart if it is already weak. Along with the medical review, the condition of the house was also examined. They checked the thermostat records to see if there were any sudden changes in temperature. They also examined the air filters to make sure there was no carbon monoxide leak or ventilation problem. No environmental hazard was identified. At this point, it became clearer that the case revolved around three things. First, a body that had undergone intense physical stress for many years. Second, a recent operation that naturally carried the risk of complications. Third, a possible psychological factor related to the observed change in behavior before the incident. In high-profile cases like this story, it's important to separate emotion from evidence. When a person is well known, it's easier to look for mystery, even if the explanation might be natural. The job of investigators is not to create a dramatic story. Their duty is to eliminate the possibilities one by one until the most logical conclusion remains. As we examine all the information, one point is clear. Sometimes a death is the result of long-term fatigue and stress that has built up over many years and isn't immediately visible on the outside. And sometimes the details that seem mysterious at first glance are just part of a bigger picture that is simple but true. In the end, it's not just the last day that matters. The years before that, which gradually affected the body, are also important. In the end, it was clear that every detail in the story was examined. They looked at the medical records, the security system, the calls, and everything that happened inside the house. Everything could possibly be natural. A body that went through many operations and extreme physical exhaustion could eventually give out. But because there are some details that can't be explained right away, the investigation continues to complete the whole picture. In situations like this, not all questions are answered right away. Some things are clear in the reports and some details still need time. Before we can fully understand, what's important is to carefully look at every part of the incident and avoid jumping to conclusions. As long as all the information in this story isn't complete, the discussion will remain open.